Okay, so these are the lectures on the book that was required for you to read and purchase, "Amusing Ourselves to Death" by Neil Postman. That's the subject of the paper. So I'm not going to discuss every single part of the book or every single thing that's required by the paper. I just want to talk mainly about the first part where he explains some of the more abstract, kind of general arguments that he has. Then in the second part, he applies them. So this should help some with your papers, but I'm not going to talk too much about the second part, in particular the sections where he discusses the influence of television on politics, because I want to leave that for you to do in your papers, okay? So he starts, and of course, he was writing in 1985 when the Soviet Union still existed. And there was, of course, a fear. He talks about 1984, this famous book by George Orwell about a very brutal, repressive, totalitarian regime in the future. He says that didn't happen. Of course, the Soviet Union was still there. Even today, I mean, it's, usually these words are thrown around in ways that they probably shouldn't be, but people will say someone is a communist or a socialist, and there's this concern about people using the government to take away freedom or liberty and so on. And there's all of that. There's that concern that government will be used for repressive purposes, can be used for repressive purposes, and that would be bad. But as he explains in the foreword, he says there has also always been a concern that actually not necessarily too much freedom, but certain types of pleasure will actually destroy us. And he compares Orwell's 1985 or 1984 with a book by Aldous Huxley called Brave New World, which was also about a future society in which people had, in a way, stopped to be human, not because the government was repressive, but because it gave them whatever they wanted immediately. And as he says at the end, Orwell was afraid that what we hate will ruin us. Huxley was afraid that what we love will ruin us. And he's sort of taking up the cause of Huxley and saying, yes, not to downplay the fact that there are repressive governments and so on, not to say that makes no difference, but we also have to look at what we enjoy, how we, as the title suggests, how we amuse ourselves, and how that sort of amusement, how these types of technologies that we use to amuse ourselves may have negative consequences. Okay, and that's really kind of what the first part of the book is about, is trying to explain how he focuses on the medium of communication, or the media of communication that societies tend to use. And he says that's actually very important for understanding a society, because the media, the type of communication that it uses, the media, the technology of communication that it uses, to a large extent determines what can actually be communicated. And he gives the example of smoke signals, for instance. He says, you can't really make philosophical arguments with smoke signals. The content is too complex. It would take too much time to actually spell out the argumentation. And even if you wanted to do that, and there was someone on the other end who was able to follow all of that and remember all of that over time as they see these little puffs of smoke going up, well, you couldn't keep the fire burning. Your blanket that you were using to create the smoke signals would burn up. Physically, it's not actually possible to do that. Okay, so if your main long distance form of communication is smoke signals, then that's going to influence what you can actually communicate through those smoke signals. Likewise, he talks about sort of pre-literate societies where writing hadn't yet been invented or was still very rare. And he says in those societies, proverbs are very important. The ability to condense certain ideas, certain forms of traditional beliefs, wisdom, and so on into very short, terse, but easy to remember sentences or aphorisms or proverbs. That was very important. He says once you start to have a society where writing is widely used, many people are literate, they know how to read, they know how to write, there's a technology like the printing press to actually disseminate writing, proverbs become much less important in law courts, for instance. In a pre-literate society, you go to a tribal elder or to a judge or something, and you present them with a dispute, and they resolve it in part by citing a particular proverb, a particular part of a particular piece of folk wisdom, which will be meaningful for both of the disputants. Once you have a printing press and paper and everything else, and everyone can read, you can write out very elaborate, very detailed law codes. You no longer have to have a legal system that relies on what a few people can actually remember. So proverbs become less important, and a very complicated, very detailed legal code becomes more important, because again, it's actually possible now physically. The technology exists that you can actually write very, volumes and volumes and volumes of laws and of interpretations of laws. And so the basic way that you start to practice law, the basic way that you start to adjudicate these types of disputes in society, changes radically with the medium of communication, with the technology that's available. Okay? So he gives these examples: smoke signals, the printing press, and then he talks about television as well. And he says, President Taft, who, as he calls him, was multi-chinned and weighed 300 pounds and so on, he says he could probably never be elected president in the age of television, because even though his actual physical weight really makes no difference to his ideas or anything else, and didn't matter in a society where there was no television, and where most people perceived him, or knew about him, knew about his ideas through print, through simply reading his speeches and his addresses and so on in newspapers. Well, the size of his body didn't matter, but when you can see it, then it starts to matter, especially because he says it's not just, I mean, there were pictures, people had some idea of what he looked like, but when your primary way of interacting with this world that's being reported on is visual, when it comes through the television, then the visual component becomes very important, because again, the actual way that you're dealing with this, the actual way that you're interacting with this person, I mean, not really interacting, because Taft doesn't know that you're watching him, but your actual way of interacting with his ideas and knowing about him and judging him and responding to him as a political actor is visual. So what you're actually doing is constantly seeing him, and you're no longer simply dealing with his ideas in a written form, but you're actually dealing with the particular physical person that you're seeing on television. And so, this is how television starts to really change things, because it's a visual medium. So the fact that you're constantly interacting with the ideas in visual form is really decisive, according to Postman, for understanding how these ideas will actually be perceived, or even what ideas can actually be expressed. Because his whole argument is complex, rational argument cannot be expressed through television. It can't be expressed through a medium like television, which is primarily visual, because visual images are not rational. They don't lend themselves to rational thought, and it's really almost impossible to use them to express rational arguments. So he says the change from a primarily print-based culture to a primarily television-based culture, or a visual culture, is a fundamental shift, and certain ideas were no longer really able to be expressed publicly through this medium of television. Okay, so that's mainly in chapter 1. In chapter 2, he sort of talks about what it means for media to be an epistemology. Basically, this is what we've just said. The basic idea is the medium that you use to express things controls what you can actually express. You can't express philosophy through smoke signals. You can't express very complicated, intricate legal codes through a purely oral culture, through having people memorize thousands and thousands of books of laws. So when you have the medium that you're using to express your ideas to some extent controls or shapes what you can actually express. And that's sort of the whole idea of media as an epistemology. The medium that you're using, the actual means that you're using to communicate, control to some extent the ideas, or dictate to some extent the ideas that can actually be expressed through that medium. So that's the basic idea behind media as an epistemology. And he goes on, one important point that he makes there is he's not criticizing television because there's a lot of junk on television. His point isn't that there are soap operas, or there's anything where there are bad sitcoms or melodramas or whatever. That's actually not what he's criticizing. He says, yes, television produces junk, but print media has produced volumes of junk, far more than television ever has. The problem isn't that straightforward junk, soap operas, bad sitcoms, etc. This isn't the problem. The problem is when television tries to be serious, it's necessarily unserious, again, because of the particular medium that it is, because of the actual technology involved. Television, a primarily visual medium, cannot express intricate ideas, rational arguments. That's his argument. Okay, he acknowledges there are some good things. The emotional effect of television, that was able to arouse strong feelings against racism in the South. When people saw images of civil rights marchers being attacked, it was able to arouse strong sentiment against the Vietnam War. When people saw people actually being injured in Vietnam. So he says it's not totally bad. However, it ultimately makes public discourse irrational because it's not capable of conveying rational ideas. Because of the actual medium that's being used, the medium of television.